You've said it more times than you'd like to count, in more versions than you can track. You never pay attention to me anymore. You're always on your phone. Do you even notice I'm here? Each time, you're not trying to start a fight. You're trying to get something you genuinely need, something that feels increasingly hard to name without sounding needy, but that boils down to a simple ache. You want to matter to your spouse the way you used to, the way that used to feel automatic instead of something you have to keep asking for. So you ask. You point it out when you're ignored. You bring it up again when nothing changes. And here's the part that probably confuses and hurts you most. The more clearly you state what you need, the further away your spouse seems to drift. It doesn't make sense. You're not asking for anything unreasonable. You're just asking to be seen. And yet, every time you voice it, something in the room gets colder instead of warmer. And you're left wondering how wanting something so basic could possibly be pushing away the very person you want it from. If that's the loop you've been living inside, I want you to know something before we go any further. Your need for attention isn't the problem. But the demanding itself might be doing something you never intended, closing a door instead of opening it, no matter how justified the demand actually is. I've talked with a lot of people caught in exactly this cycle, asking for something completely reasonable and watching the asking itself seem to make things worse rather than better, no matter how many times or how many different ways they've tried phrasing the same underlying need. I want to be honest with you before we go any further, because I think you deserve that more than you deserve a comforting oversimplification. I'm not going to tell you that wanting attention from your spouse is asking too much. It isn't. What I am going to do is walk you through why demanding attention tends to produce the opposite of what you're hoping for, even when the underlying need is completely legitimate, and what a different approach could actually look like. Not because there's a magic phrase that guarantees connection, but because you deserve to understand what the demanding itself might be doing, separate from how valid your need actually is, a distinction that's easy to lose sight of when you're the one still waiting to be noticed. When someone reaches this exact place, needing attention and repeatedly demanding it without the desired result, there are really only a handful of paths this tends to take from here. The first path is continuing to demand, escalating the requests, the complaints, the pointed comments, hoping that eventually the message will land the way you need it to. The second path is the opposite, going silent about the need entirely, swallowing it, convincing yourself you shouldn't need this much attention in the first place, and quietly resenting the absence you've stopped mentioning out loud. And the third path is something different from both, shifting from demanding to inviting, communicating what you want without pressure or obligation attached, while also building sources of fulfillment that don't depend entirely on your spouse's response. I'm not going to tell you which path fits your situation. I can't know that from here. But I do want you to understand what tends to happen down each of these three roads, because most people caught in this exact loop only ever try the first one, assuming that if their spouse still isn't responding, they simply haven't asked clearly or forcefully enough yet, and then trying again with even more force, which usually just deepens the exact pattern they're hoping to break. Let's start with why demanding attention tends to backfire, because I think it's more understandable than it feels from the inside. Attention that's given under pressure doesn't register the same way, either to the person giving it or the person receiving it, as attention that's freely offered. When a request starts to feel like an obligation, something you're expected to provide or face consequences for withholding, most people, even people who genuinely love the person asking, experience a kind of internal resistance to it, almost involuntarily. That resistance isn't usually about not caring. It's a nearly universal human response to feeling controlled or cornered, even by someone you love, even when what's being asked for is completely reasonable on its own terms. There's a specific irony worth naming here, too. Attention that arrives because it was demanded tends to feel hollow, even to the person receiving it, not just the person giving it. It's marked internally as compliance rather than desire. And most people can tell the difference between someone showing up because they wanted to and someone showing up because they were pressured into it. That means even a partially successful demand, one that does produce more attention, often doesn't actually satisfy the underlying need, because what you were really hoping for was to be wanted, not merely attended to on schedule. And here's something worth sitting with, because it applies to almost every decision inside a pattern like this. Everything you do, or don't do, carries a short-term consequence and a long-term one. In the short term, demanding feels productive. You're naming the problem clearly, refusing to let it go unaddressed, standing up for something you genuinely deserve. But the long-term consequence of repeated demanding is that your spouse starts to associate you, specifically, with pressure and obligation, rather than warmth and invitation. And once that association forms, their instinct in your presence often shifts from wanting to be near you to wanting to avoid disappointing you, which are two very different emotional states that produce very different behavior, even though from the outside, they can look similar. A spouse trying to avoid disappointing you might show up dutifully, but they're not showing up toward you. They're showing up away from consequence, which rarely produces the felt sense of closeness either of you is actually after. I also want to name something that might be hard to hear, but I think it matters. Demanding attention often escalates precisely because it isn't working, which creates a particularly painful trap. When a request goes unanswered, the natural instinct is to ask more insistently, more frequently, with more emotional weight attached, which, given how resistance to pressure tends to work, usually makes the underlying withdrawal worse rather than better. The very strategy meant to close the gap ends up widening it, not because your need was wrong, but because the delivery method was working against the outcome you were actually hoping for. It's a genuinely cruel dynamic to be caught inside. The more urgently you need something, the more likely you are to reach for a strategy that makes it less likely to arrive. Now, let's actually look at where each of these three paths tends to lead, starting with the first, continuing to demand, escalating when it doesn't produce results. In the short term, this path feels like the only responsible option. Staying silent would mean accepting neglect, so speaking up, even forcefully, feels like self-respect. But I want to be honest about the long-term consequence of that same choice. Spouses who consistently experience requests as demands tend to develop a kind of preemptive avoidance, arriving home a little later, engaging a little less. Not necessarily out of malice, but because the anticipated pressure has made your presence something to brace for, rather than something to move toward. Over time, some spouses describe feeling like they can never quite do enough, which paradoxically makes trying feel pointless rather than motivating. I want to be fair to this path, though, because asking clearly for what you need isn't the actual problem. The frequency, tone, and framing usually are. There's a real difference between stating a genuine need once, honestly, and repeating the same complaint in escalating forms every time it goes unmet. The first is healthy communication. The second tends to function less as connection seeking and more as a kind of ongoing pressure campaign, even when that's never the intention behind it, and even when every individual instance of it feels completely justified in the moment it's happening. The second path, going silent about the need, suppressing it entirely, tends to feel like relief at first and corrosive over time. In the short term, not bringing it up anymore can feel like taking the high road, refusing to nag or demand. But the long-term consequence of consistently swallowing a real need is that it doesn't actually disappear. It usually turns into a quiet, accumulating resentment that eventually leaks out sideways, in irritability, in distance, in a kind of flat disengagement that's just as damaging as the original demanding, only harder for your spouse to identify or respond to because nothing is being said directly anymore. I think of a situation I've seen more than once, with the details changed but the shape kept intentionally similar. Someone who, exhausted by repeated demanding that never worked, decided to simply stop asking altogether, telling themselves they'd find contentment elsewhere. For a while, the household felt calmer, but underneath the calm, resentment kept building, quietly, until it eventually surfaced not as a request, but as a much colder kind of withdrawal. The exact distance they'd originally been trying so hard to prevent, just arrived at through silence instead of demand. Their spouse, oddly, noticed the change, and even found it unsettling in its own way, sensing that something had gone wrong without being told what, since nothing was being said directly anymore for them to actually respond to. The third path, shifting from demanding to inviting, while also building fulfillment outside the marriage that doesn't rely entirely on your spouse's response, is the one that actually tends to change the dynamic over time. This looks like replacing "you never make time for me" with something closer to "I'd really love it if we went for a walk together tonight. No pressure if you're not up for it." Genuine invitations, rather than complaints framed as requests. I think of another situation, again with the details changed, but the shape kept intentionally similar. Someone who had spent months pointing out every instance of neglect, and instead started offering small, low-stakes invitations without attaching consequences to a no. And, alongside that, started rebuilding friendships and interests that had quietly atrophied while all their emotional energy had gone into pursuing their spouse's attention. A shift that took real, deliberate effort to sustain at first. Their spouse, no longer facing pressure or guilt every time they walked in the door, started gradually re-engaging on their own terms, not because they'd been forced to, but because presence had stopped feeling like an obligation and started feeling like a genuine choice again. That's usually what the long-term consequence of this path looks like. Slower, less guaranteed, but built on something that can actually last, rather than something extracted under pressure that tends to evaporate the moment the pressure lifts. It's also worth naming that this path required real patience. The improvement wasn't immediate, and there were weeks where it looked like nothing had changed at all, before the shift became noticeable in any consistent way. I know how painful it is to feel invisible in your own marriage, and only you know how long you've been asking for attention that hasn't been coming. I can't know that from here, and I wouldn't presume to. But if you want something that walks you through this more deeply, a way to actually work through inviting connection instead of demanding it, I put together 3 step-by-step guides for every stage of a marriage crisis, including exactly this kind of moment. The Complete Marriage Rescue Trilogy. It's linked in the first comment below, whenever you're ready to look at it. Now, let's keep going. Here's the part I really want you to sit with before we finish today. Your need for attention is completely valid. The way you've been asking for it might not be working. And those are 2 separate things worth untangling from each other. Attention given under pressure rarely feels like the attention you were actually hoping for, even when you finally get it. Which means demanding harder isn't usually the answer, even when the need underneath it is real and deserves to be met. In some form. Eventually. I'm not here to tell you to stop needing attention from your spouse, or to pretend you're fine when you're not. That's not the goal here. And it's your decision how to navigate what you actually need. Nobody outside your marriage, including me, gets to tell you what you should be satisfied with. But if you do want support thinking this through, a clear way to understand this pattern and what actually helps instead of demanding or suppressing, that's exactly what the Complete Marriage Rescue Trilogy was built for. It's not a lecture telling you to want less. And it's not a script for the perfect invitation to use tonight. It's 3 guides that walk you through the pattern itself, one piece at a time, at whatever pace genuinely fits where you are, without asking you to pretend the underlying need isn't real while you work on the delivery. It's linked in the first comment below. Take your time with it. Go look at it when you're actually ready. There's no rush on my end, and there shouldn't be on yours either. Before you go, I want to leave you with this. Wanting your spouse's attention isn't too much to ask, and I don't want you to hear anything I've said today as a reason to feel guilty for needing to feel seen in your own marriage. But there's a real difference between asking for connection and demanding it, and only one of those two tends to actually produce the closeness you're looking for. There isn't a universal script for how to ask, and I'd be lying if I told you there was one. What's right is going to depend on your history, your spouse, and what you're both actually willing to build together, honestly, over time. If any part of what I talked about today felt a little too familiar, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments how you've been asking for attention lately, and whether it's felt more like an invitation or a demand, even if that's a hard thing to admit honestly, even to yourself. Not to be judged, and not to be told exactly how to fix it by strangers on the internet, just to be heard by other people quietly caught in the same exhausting cycle. Wherever you are in this tonight, your need to be seen is real, and it deserves an approach that actually has a chance of getting you there, instead of one that's been quietly working against you every time you've reached for it.